Have you ever wondered why historical clothing has so many layers to it? Hello and welcome. I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're taking a generic look at overarching what the underwear layers pre 1920s were and why. Because this is going to be more of a general overlook at what the different layers were, I'm not going to mention every single type of skirt support or padding that existed throughout history, but I am going to tell you where in the layers does that sort of garments go if that era requires them. I will go into detail about why that garment existed in the first place, rather than the nuance of how the different shapes change throughout history. This is more about what is the function of the garments and why it existed in the first place, rather than the specific how it changes and evolves throughout history. And that being said, all of these garments do evolve throughout history in their shape and form, depending on the fashion, but the function stays the same. And because people in the past would dress a lot more for the seasons than we do nowadays, I'm not going to go into the specifics of winter dressing. This is kind of like the base layers, the bare minimum, so to speak. So just know that people in the past were not stupid and they did evolve their dress for the seasons. But that being said, this is the bare minimum. You wouldn't go less than this no matter how hot it is, because you needed these. These all have a specific function that you need both in heat and in cold. So basically what you would do if you wanted cooler for the summer, instead of lessening the layers, you'd make the layers thinner and of more sweat absorbent and less hot materials, especially linen. Throughout history, whether we're talking about ancient Rome or Greek or the Viking era or anything up until the 1920s, your base layer is a chemise, shift, or whatever you want to call it. The name changes throughout time. The sleeve shape, or whether there actually is sleeves or not, that changes throughout time. And the length of this garment changes throughout time. But the basic function of having something between your skin and the rest of the clothing was up there always up until the mid 1920s. Though the name of this garment changes throughout history, I'm going to be calling it shift now, just simply because it's easier to use just one name. But basically because the function doesn't change, it doesn't matter what the name is for the garment. Up until the mid-19th century, the shift was typically made out of linen. After that, it was often made out of cotton, not because cotton would be superior in any way to linen, actually quite the opposite. The only reason why it started dominating this garment was simply because cotton became so cheap. And the reason why this garment was most often made out of linen is because this garment's function is to protect both your outer garments from your sweat, your body oils, any dirt that comes off of your skin, because people are actually quite dirty. And then, of course, it works in the opposite direction, also protecting your skin from the outer clothing. So that if you have materials that aren't necessarily safe to be against your skin, like, for instance, arsenic green, it wouldn't be against your actual skin because there is a garment in between you and the outer garment. And also because the shift is not dyed, it is either its natural color, being it linen or cotton, or it is bleached. So it also protects you from any kind of dyes that there are. And a lot of the dyes used to dye fabric were actually quite harsh and could cause skin irritation, especially if the dye got wet and it started to run. And a lot of the dyes actually did run a little bit when wet, because you didn't need them to be completely color fast, because it wouldn't touch your skin, so it wouldn't cause a problem. And another function for this garment, and especially for the linen in this garment, is that linen is a very poor breeding ground for bacteria. And because this garment's main purpose is to absorb those sweat and body oils, so the antibacterial, or we call them antibacterial, even though it actually isn't antibacterial, it's just a poor breeding ground, those properties in the garment would actually keep it from smelling like sweat and getting that bad, foul body odor to it. So even though people in the past didn't have the antiperspirants we have nowadays, that undergarment, that shift, would actually help absorb the sweat and also keep it from smelling. Because as sweat comes out of your body, it doesn't actually smell. It's on the skin where it comes into contact with these bacteria that cause the smell. So once it's immediately wicked away and absorbed by the shift, that doesn't ever become an issue. And of course, because this layer of garment is the one who will get the sweat immediately, that also means that if it gets pit stains, they will most likely stay in the shift rather than go all the way absorbed through all the other layers all the way to the actual outer garment. So you could wear the same garment for quite a long time before you have to worry about any sort of pit staining. And at this point, I also need to mention laundering practices a little bit, and the fact that most of the outer clothing, especially silk, but also some wool garments, were not really meant to be washed. Or if they were washed, it was usually just spot cleaned, or very, very infrequently would you dunk the entire outer garment into water. The normal cleaning methods for the outer garments would be just to air them out and spot clean any specific stains, and you could also spritz them with vodka and even like put them just outside or commonly also into the outhouse so that the fumes from urine, mainly ammonia, would kill any bacteria or anything, any foul smells that had stayed on the outer garment. And because that outer garment never touched your skin, you didn't really have to worry about shed skin or body oils or stuff like that that would build up into the fibers. And dirt from dusty roads or just, regular gunk that comes onto the clothing usually can come off with just a simple brushing. No matter what your social status was, fabric was still very expensive. So that's why you would take care of your clothing as best as you could and try to protect the outer garments from your body as much as possible. And the next layer to come after your shift would be your corset or stays from the 17th century onward. I have a separate video that goes more into depth what is the purpose and the history of the corset or stays. So I won't be going into super details in this one, but the main function of this garment is basically to offer bust support and shaping to your body to give whatever that fashionable silhouette is. And that does not mean necessarily tight lacing, and for most of history, for most of women, that would never mean tight lacing. It basically just meant that it would move that soft tissue around to create whatever was, or help create whatever was the fashionable shape. Because throughout history, fashion was about the silhouette and the created shape. Not necessarily so much about the individual garments, but rather the overarching silhouette and that created body. The idea was that your private body is the body underneath all the layers, and that outside body, the body that you present to the world, is that whatever is the fashionable silhouette that is created by artificial means. And though the created silhouette is a thing already earlier in history, in the 17th century it really solidifies as something very vastly different from the body underneath. And because the corset is a fairly tight and rigid garment, it is not comfortable against your skin if that is next to your skin. It can cause all sort of irritation rashes from both heat and just the friction of a solid thing right against your body. So that's also, again, a reason why the shift underneath is super important, because it protects your skin from getting irritated by the corset, and it keeps your corset clean and keeps the body oils and sweat off the corset so that your corset does not become funky. Even if it actually, like, the sweat soaks through and you can feel that your corset is moist, just an airing out usually is perfectly enough as long as you're wearing the shift, because the shift will absorb any bacteria that comes with the sweat so that the corset itself won't smell like sweat even if the shift does. And then the next layer is your petticoat. Your petticoat can, in certain eras, be actually worn underneath the stays. or they can be worn over the corset. It varies a little bit. But basically, the main function of this garment is to keep your stockings and your legs from clinging on to your outer garments as you walk. Because skirts, especially narrow ones, but even wider ones, they will want to stick to those fibers in those stockings. And you'll have, as you move in them, you'll actually have that skirt material bunch up against them, and it can actually even cause static electricity if you're not wearing a petticoat underneath. So the petticoat's main function is to smooth out everything, and it can help create the fashionable silhouette. This petticoat isn't necessarily for that, but it can function in that way too. But the main purpose is to keep your legs and the skirt from touching each other and to keep that friction from happening. And that's why if you have huge skirt supports like big hoops, any sort of big panniers, or a big hoop skirt, that would go over one petticoat. You'd want to have something first there against your body. But then if you're wearing smaller skirt supports, like for instance, let's say a small bustle, that would go under the petticoat. And you do need a petticoat over any sort of hoops, any sort of panniers, or anything you're wearing as far as shapewear goes, because you do want to smooth out any lines that would be visible otherwise. You don't want any harsh lines from where the support garments end, and that will happen if you don't have an extra layer of fabric there. In the 19th century and later on, you would of course have underneath the petticoat still a pair of drawers, basically your panties. But I'm not going to go much into detail about those because I will be doing a separate video on the history of underpants, because that is such a huge topic on its own. But you get the function of panties in general, so whether they're huge drawers or the small modern panties, the basic function of the garment is still the same. And the reason why this garment came into existence was simply because your shift or chemise got smaller so that it didn't protect your legs as much as the previous garments, because you didn't need any sort of underpants when your legs were already protected by the long smock or shift. Because again, the main function of the undergarments is to protect your outer garments and your skin from touching each other. And from this we get to the next point about laundering. Really the most frequently laundered, the thing that we would launder all the time, is your shift. The other garments are less frequently laundered or not laundered at all. Your corset would normally not get laundered. Your petticoat, of course, could get laundered, but it would be laundered much less frequently than your shift would. Now, how many petticoats you would have depended completely on the era and what shape we're trying to get with the outer garments, and of course temperature. The more structural elements we have underneath the garments, the more petticoats we'll most likely need to build up that silhouette. And also, if we go look at the Victorian era, in that mid-19th century, where you don't yet wear the hoop skirt, you wear tons of petticoats to build up that silhouette. The typical number of petticoats in any era is typically between 1 and 3, but specifically in the mid-19th century, when we were building the silhouette with the petticoats, rather than having yet the big hoop skirts that would help build the silhouette, you could have even 5 or 7 petticoats. Prior to corsets or stays, the petticoat would also have a bodice to it, and this would function as your bust support and silhouette building layer. So it would function both as the petticoat and as the corset or stays. And the next layer is your corset cover from the mid-19th century onwards. In the 1850s and 60s, it is still seen sometimes, but not always. But after the 1870s, it becomes standard. And like the name implies, it covers up your corset. So it helps smooth out any possible lines from the corset and creates that smooth silhouette and helps with bust support, especially if the corset is more lower bust and your bust kind of hanging there with less of the sideways support. Because throughout the Victorian era, corset shapes, especially in the bust area, change quite a bit, and sometimes they're quite low, sometimes they're quite high, and it varies a lot. And then after we leave the Victorian era, when we go to the Edwardian era, the corset cover also gains the function of supporting your bust and helping that corset to stay with your bust, because it doesn't have any more the cup shape, even though often corsets can come up to the bust. So then it supports that structure so that the corset stays with your bust as you move. And then as we get into the later Edwardian era and 19-teens era and 1920s, corsets lower to be often under bust. And at this point, you can sometimes opt out from the corset cover and wear a brassiere instead. Sometimes corset covers and brassieres are very similar, and sometimes it's kind of hard to tell them apart and where that line specifically is. But the main function of both of these garments is to provide that support and to help with the silhouette. Because the corset cover is very much also a silhouette building garment. Depending on what that era's silhouette is, that would help fill out whatever parts needed filling out, and however the bust is supposed to be shaped, the corset cover would help with that. Or especially in the Edwardian era with the pigeon front shape, the corset cover would help build up that pigeon bust shape, because nobody is shaped like that naturally. And if you needed some padding support and help with shaping that fashionable silhouette in the bust area, that would usually come underneath the corset cover, so the corset cover would smooth any possible lines from padding. And at the same time, your corset cover is your last defense against sweat to protect your outer garments from armpit stains. And this is true regardless of whether your corset cover has sleeves or not, because it comes fairly high in the armpit area, so that it does provide protection, and it helps absorb the sweat rather into the corset cover than into the outer fabric, because it was right against that armpit anyways. And that corset cover also provided a good place for placing any dress shields, or armpit stain shield basically. Dress shields could come in many different shapes, and some of them even had like a harness thing that you could attach it to your body by just the harness, rather than having anything else that you would need to attach it to. But the basic idea is that it's always a shaped thing where you have an absorbent fabric against your skin, something comfortable, and then you would have again another absorbent or regular fabric on the other side, and oftentimes sandwiched in between this would be a layer of something waterproof. Prior to plastics, this waterproof layer could be oiled fabric, or it could even be wool, because a felted or really like thick wool will be fairly waterproof, or it more often it was some sort of natural latex. And this would go in your armpit area. It could also attach to your outer garment, or it could attach to that corset cover, and it would protect your outer garment from your sweat. And this would be then the last guard, and this could be tossed in the laundry, or before laundry machines, obviously you would toss this in with the shifts when you go to boil them. Because the shift, the thing that you wear next to your skin, that layer was usually boiled and washed with very harsh methods to make it sure that it was clean. Because even though people didn't understand necessarily about bacteria, they did understand about cleanliness, and they did understand the same basic concepts that we still use today, like heat to kill bacteria, even though they didn't know it was called bacteria yet. And then lastly, of course, comes your outer dress or gown. This garment is usually not just the fashion fabric you see. It usually, at least in the bodice area, has a lining. And this is not only to give the garment more structure and make it fit your body better without wrinkling, but it is also there again for protection that it keeps the expensive fashion fabrics cleaner. Because if something does soak through all these other layers, you still have something that can help absorb things before it actually hits that fancy, expensive fabric on the outside. Because again, the main purpose of garments and the main idea of hygiene was to keep your garments clean from you because you are dirty. They really didn't see the outside being such a threat to the garments and their cleanliness as they did see themselves as the threat to the cleanliness. So their main concern was to how to keep those body oils and sweat and muck that came off your skin all the time, keep that off from the outer garments rather than worry so much about what comes from the outside onto your garments. But here I do need to dispel a myth. People in the past were not dirty. They absolutely did wash themselves, especially things like armpits, your private area, and your hands were washed daily, and hands especially many times a day. People in the past were not dirty just because they didn't take daily baths. How many of us modern people take a daily bath? They would usually, instead of a shower, they would sponge bathe. So that means they would have a little basin where they have the clean water and possibly soap in that, or then they'd lather the soap with the water onto their bodies, and they would use a sponge to clean their bodies that way. Because people naturally like good smells. We don't like the smell of body odor. We don't like to smell bad. If we can, we try to do our best to stay clean, smelling fresh, and no, they would not cover just bad scents with adding perfume and other scents on top of that, because we wouldn't do that nowadays. We have all kinds of smells that stay much longer because synthetic smells will always stay much longer and have much more staying power than natural scents. So if people liked to do that, it would make much more sense that us modern people would do that rather than people in the past. So no, they did not do that. They absolutely did clean their bodies. And another function of all these layers together is that they provide heat regulation, because they provide some insulation to your body, but an insulation that still allows you to breathe so that it doesn't become stifling hot. Heat doesn't accumulate in the layers, but you're underneath all those layers, it creates a cocoon where your body temperature stays very even. So it doesn't matter if it's hot or cold outside or in the area you're in. It tends to regulate your body temperature better and keep you either cooler or warmer depending on what you need to stay at, because it keeps that air inside there at a very even temperature. And because of the cleanliness factor, also usually socks were longer, and that's why throughout history we've mostly worn stockings, because that again, it provides another layer between you and the world and your garments, so that it keeps you cleaner, it keeps your temperature more even, and provides another layer that can easily be washed and that can get dirt on it. Because most of us, when we walk, if you have ever noticed when you've been in a walk in a really dusty place in a skirt or dress, you're wearing stockings, you'll notice that it actually gets dirty and you get this like weird like dirt line actually quite high up on your calves. And that's because as we walk, we pick up that dirt, and that dirt starts flying around our legs as we walk, and as we churn the earth when we walk. So that builds a small dust cloud there, and that hits our calves constantly. So that's one of the functions of stockings, is to protect your skin from that muck and dirt that you kick up as you walk. So stockings are really the garment that is meant to protect you from the outside, even more than it is to protect the outside from you. And as kind of a bonus layer, I can also mention your cap. This, of course, goes out of fashion sometime in the mid-19th century, but before that, and even after that, especially during the nighttime, a cap would be an essential part of a woman's wardrobe. And this was to protect the hair from any grease, dirt, all the things that can come from cooking, cleaning, and going outdoors. Because the idea was that you wouldn't wash your hair very frequently, but instead you would more frequently comb or brush it, depending on the era. The brush doesn't really become fashionable until the 19th century. So the caps, or earlier in the centuries, the veil's purpose was to protect your hair. So it wasn't so much a modesty thing, though sometimes it was marketed as that. But the main function of it was to protect your hair and keep it clean. And so even after the mid-19th century, when they fell out of favor during the daytime, they were often worn in the evening time and nighttime when you would sleep, and to keep it from frizzing or destroying your hairdo. Especially when the curly hair came into fashion, you would use that cap or a scarf later on in history to protect those curls and keep it from frizzing, keep it from getting static, so that you could maintain the hairstyles. And now for the last element that is like the base of your clothing is mitts or gloves. These are not always worn by all classes, especially working women would not wear full-on gloves when they're working indoors and things like this, but you would often wear them going outdoors. And even earlier when you wore the half mitts, those would be often worn for working. And this is again to protect your hands and keep your hands clean, but also mitts were worn especially during the 18th century to cover this part of your arm because most of the gowns would end here. And that's one of the reasons why in the Victorian era you would wear gloves whenever shaking hands or dancing or doing any sort of activity where you touch other people, but you would take your gloves off for eating and drinking, because you would get all the bacteria, though they didn't know that it was called bacteria, but they understood the concept anyways, of getting dirt or getting some illness or something from the other person, and they wanted to protect themselves from that. So that's why you would wear the gloves for touching things, and then when you would eat or drink, you would have clean hands underneath the gloves. And the reason why, especially in the Victorian era, you often see ladies wearing little lace gloves for summertime, because that would also help, again, with sweat. It absorbs the sweat and helps keep your hands feeling dry and cooler than if they are just sweaty, and especially if you're touching things, your hands get extremely sweaty if it is hot, but that glove absorbs any possible sweat and protects you from directly touching onto the object, so there's more room for air circulation underneath, so actually it keeps your body cooler. And of course, hats and parasols and all these other elements can be used to give you shade. Also, your outer clothing, oftentimes we think that people in the past were very modest, when especially during the daytime, they would often, in most times in history, cover up a lot of skin. But it wasn't necessarily so much because of modesty, but rather from protecting your skin from the sun, because it's actually a lot cooler to protect and cover up your skin than have the skin be directly affected by the sun and having the sun beat straight onto your skin, where it can really heat up the skin. And then, of course, depending on the weather, you would wear any kind of outer garments, coats, capes, other things like this. But I'm not going to go into that because those aren't the basic layers. These are the basic layers that you would wear no matter what. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. And if you did, please hit that like button because it really does help out in this world. And if you'd like to see more videos by me, and I really hope you do, then please consider subscribing if you haven't done that already, and I'll see you again next time. Bye!